Dr. Merritt Kessler delivered both of my neighbor's children, set my mother's broken wrist, and was voted Pella's Citizen of the Year 3 times. He also killed at least 3 people with a compound he was never authorized to use, and wrote the proof on 31 prescription pads. My name is Lee Patton. I'm an HVAC technician. I crawled into a storage unit to check a condenser coil and found 6 banker's boxes stamped Kessler Family Practice. In the third box, a file labeled Compound T4, Patient Outcomes. Certain names had red dots next to them. 1 I recognized. 2 I didn't. Both dead. Same cause, same doctor. And the night I walked into that town council chamber with his own records under my arm, Merritt Kessler saw me at the podium, and his face went the color of old paper. But I need to back up. If you're listening to this right now, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I haven't told you yet is how long this man had been doing this, who knew about it, and what they did to try to keep me quiet. Drop where you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one, and knowing people are out there listening is the reason I'm able to tell this at all. Let me take you back to March of 2024. A broken condenser in a storage facility on Route 163. That's where this starts. I'd lived in Pella my whole life, born there, graduated from Pella High in 2004, started working HVAC at 19 for a company called Heartland Climate out of Oskaloosa, and by 26, I had my own van and my own clients. Small town, steady work. You fix the dentist's office in January, the church in July, and in between, you do houses. Everybody knows you. Everybody waves. You can't walk into the IGA without seeing 3 people you've done work for. That's just Pella. 5 square miles and 10,000 opinions. And everybody, I mean everybody, went to Dr. Kessler. Merritt Kessler had been the family doctor in Pella for 23 years. His practice was on Franklin Street between the hardware store and the old bakery. He was the kind of guy who remembered your kid's name, asked about your dog, stayed late if you needed him. My mom swore by him. Half the town did. I did HVAC for his clinic twice a year. Spring check, fall check. His office manager always had coffee ready when I came in. She was the kind of woman who knew where every file was and never let you forget it. I knew the layout of that building better than most people. The crawl space under the east wing, the mechanical closet behind exam room 3, the ductwork that ran above the records room. I could draw you a floor plan from memory. The fluorescent light in the storage hallway buzzed at a frequency I could identify by ear. That's how many hours I'd spent in that building. I think that's why it happened the way it did. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just the guy who knew where the pipes went. In March of 2024, the owner of a storage facility on Route 163, a retired farmer who ran the place mostly as something to do between fishing trips, called me about a condenser unit that kept tripping the breaker. Standard stuff. I drove out, parked on the gravel lot, and crawled into Unit 14. The overhead lights in that row had a low metallic hum that got into your teeth. And that's when I saw the boxes. 6 of them. Cardboard. The kind doctor's offices use for files. And stamped on each one, in faded blue ink, Kessler Family Practice. Archive. I should have left them alone. I think about that a lot. I should have checked the condenser, written my invoice, and driven home. But one of the boxes was open. The lid was off. And the folder on top was labeled Compound T4, Patient Outcomes. I pulled it out. I don't know why. Something about the way it was labeled, like it was a study, not a patient file. I sat down on the concrete floor of that storage unit and I started reading. The folder contained 31 patient entries. Each one had a name, a dosage schedule, and a column for outcomes. Most of the entries were routine. Stable, no adverse reaction, discontinued. But 3 entries had red dots next to them. Handwritten red dots, in ink, circled twice. The first red dot, Corinne Holst, age 44, dosage started September 2020. Outcome, deceased May 2021. Cause listed as acute renal failure. The second, a man named Boyd Linden, age 61. Dosage started March 2019. Outcome, deceased November 2019. Same cause. The third, a woman named Patrice Delacroix, age 52.
Dosage started January 2022. Outcome: deceased, August 2023. 3 people, same compound, same organ failure, same doctor. And the compound name, T4, didn't appear in any standard pharmaceutical database. I know because I looked it up on my phone right there, sitting on that concrete floor with dust on my knees and the smell of motor oil and old cardboard in the back of my throat.
I didn't understand what I was holding. Not yet. I just knew it was wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your hands go cold, even when the air is warm. I took the folder home. I know I probably shouldn't have. But I photographed every page with my phone first, put the folder back in the box, and closed the lid. Then I drove home and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. My wife, Renee, came in from picking up our daughter and asked what was wrong. I said I wasn't sure yet. That was honest. I didn't know what I was looking at. The next morning I went back to the storage unit. The owner was in his office eating a ham sandwich and didn't ask what I was doing. I told him the condenser needed a part, which was true, but I also opened the other 5 boxes. 3 of them were standard patient files, appointment records, insurance forms, nothing unusual. I kept going. The 4th box had billing statements from a laboratory in Cedar Rapids called Vantage Bioanalytics. I'd never heard of it. The statements were for something called compound formulation and stability testing, and they went back to 2017. My hands were damp and I wiped them on my jeans before I opened the next folder. I didn't know yet what I was building toward, but the weight in my chest kept getting heavier. The 5th box, the one at the bottom of the stack, had a 3-ring binder, black cover, no label on the outside. I had to step outside the unit for a second just to breathe. The fluorescent lights were buzzing and the air was stale, and I stood in the corridor with my hands on my knees for about 30 seconds. Then I went back in. I opened the binder and found what looked like a clinical trial protocol. 47 pages. Header: Exploratory Evaluation of T4 Compound in Treatment-Resistant Inflammatory Conditions. The principal investigator listed on the protocol was Dr. Merritt Kessler, and the approval status, stamped in red at the top of the first page, said, Discontinued. Sponsor withdrawal, July 2018. July 2018. The trial was supposed to have ended in 2018, but the patient outcome file, the one with the red dots, had dosage entries going all the way through 2023. I didn't know it at the time, but that binder would be the thing that ended his career. Now, here's where it got complicated. The clinic had been sold and remodeled in 2022. The new physician group had briefly operated out of the same building before Kessler bought back the practice. For a few minutes, sitting there in that unit, I thought maybe it wasn't him. Maybe someone else had continued the prescriptions after the sale. Maybe the records were from a transition period and Kessler hadn't been the one writing those dosages after 2018. 5 years after the trial was shut down, someone was still giving people this compound, and the records pointed at Kessler, but I wasn't certain, not yet. I sat there staring at that binder in the half-dark of that storage unit. I could hear the owner's radio playing through the wall. I could smell motor oil and old cardboard. And I remember thinking, this can't be what it looks like. But it was. I told Renee that night. She got very quiet. She said, Lee, this is not something we should be touching. And I understood what she meant. Merritt Kessler wasn't just a doctor in Pella. He was on the hospital board. He was an elder at the Reformed Church. He donated to the schools, sponsored the Little League team, had his name on a bench at the Tulip Time grounds. You don't accuse a man like that of killing his patients. Not in Pella. Not without being absolutely sure. So I started being sure. Over the next 2 weeks, I went back to the storage unit 4 more times. The owner thought I was still working on the condenser. I photographed everything. Every page of the trial protocol, every patient entry, every lab invoice. I organized the photos in a folder on my laptop labeled HVAC-163, because even then I was scared of someone finding it. Kessler had once told me I was the most reliable person in town, reliable enough to photograph 300 pages of his own records without missing a single one. And during that second week, I ran into Dr. Kessler, not at the clinic, at the gas station on Washington Street. He was filling up his Volvo. Silver. He always drove a silver Volvo. He looked at me, smiled, and said, Lee, how's the family?
I said fine. He said he'd see me for the spring HVAC check in a couple of weeks. And then he said something that I replay in my head a lot. He said, "You know, you're one of the most reliable people in this town. I always tell people if you want something done right, call Lee Patton." He meant it as a compliment. But standing there with 300 photographs of his own records on my phone, it felt heavier than that, darker. I want to talk about Corinne Holst for a minute because she's the reason I didn't walk away.
Corinne taught music at Jefferson Elementary for 16 years. My daughter Alma had her for 3rd and 4th grade. Corinne was the kind of teacher who stayed after school to help kids who couldn't afford instruments. She ran the choir for the Tulip Time Festival every May. 38 kids in matching shirts, standing on risers in the town square singing Dutch folk songs. Pella, without Corinne Holst running that choir, was just different. You could feel the hole. She got sick in early 2021. At first, it was fatigue, then her kidneys started failing. She was in and out of the hospital in Oskaloosa for 3 months. Her husband Darren took a leave from his job at the co-op to take care of her. The 2 boys, I think they were 12 and 15 at the time, watched their mother disappear from the living room to the hospital bed and back again. She died on May 9th, 2021. The death certificate said acute renal failure of unknown origin. Nobody questioned it. Kidneys fail. It happens. It happened to Corinne, and Pella grieved, and we all went to the service at 3rd Reformed, and Dr. Kessler was in the 3rd pew. 3rd pew, I can see in there. Dark suit, hands folded, looking down at the program. He was treating her. He was giving her the compound that killed her, and he sat in that church and let everyone grieve without knowing what he'd done. I need to stop for a second. The other day I was driving past Jefferson Elementary, and I heard kids singing through an open window. I pulled over and sat there for a minute with the engine running. Have you ever found out something about someone you trusted? Something that made you go back through every memory and feel sick? Every handshake, every smile, all of it meant something different from what you thought? I'd sit with that for a long time, honestly. If you've been there, tell me. I want to know I'm not alone in that feeling. Because what happened next is when I started connecting the dots, and what I found was that Kessler hadn't just continued the trial, he'd been escalating it. I looked up Boyd Linden. He was a retired maintenance worker from Newton, 61 when he died. He'd moved to Pella in 2016 to be closer to his daughter, saw Dr. Kessler for chronic back pain. Died in November 2019, acute renal failure. Then Patrice Delacroix, 52, worked at the county recorder's office in Knoxville. Drove to Pella for appointments because, and I found this out later, a friend had recommended Dr. Kessler. She had rheumatoid arthritis. She started seeing Kessler in late 2021. She died in August 2023. 3 patients, 3 deaths. Same unexplained organ failure, same compound. And here's the thing, their deaths were spread across 4 years in 2 different counties. Nobody connected them. Why would they? One was a music teacher, one was a retired worker, one lived in a different county. They didn't know each other. They didn't share a social circle. The only thing they shared was a doctor and a 3-character notation on their medical records. T4. That's when it stopped being curiosity and became something else. I don't have a good word for what it became. Obligation, maybe. The feeling that I'd seen something I couldn't unsee and walking away would make me part of it. The first person I told, besides Renee, was Darren Holst. I drove to Darren's house on a Sunday afternoon. He was living in the same house on Elm Street, same one Corinne had painted that yellow. The boys were at their grandmother's. Darren opened the door and he looked tired. Not the kind of tired you get from a long day, the kind that lives behind your eyes. I told him I'd found something. I told him about the files, the compound, the 3 red dots. I told him Corinne's name was on the list. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat on the edge of his couch with his hands on his knees. And then he said, "I always thought there was something wrong with how fast it happened." That was all he said for about 5 minutes. We just sat there. Darren became the person I could talk to. Not an investigator, he didn't have the skills or the stomach for that. But he was there. Every time I wanted to quit, I'd think about Darren sitting on that couch, looking at his hands. And I'd keep going. When Darren said he'd support me, whatever I needed, I felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time since the storage unit, I thought, maybe this will be straightforward. Maybe I just
Need to show the right person and the system will do what it's supposed to do. It didn't work that way. Now, I need to tell you about the wrong road I went down because I wasted 3 weeks on it.
In the lab invoices from Cedar Rapids, there was a name that kept appearing: Felix Arnaud, a pharmaceutical sales representative who'd signed off on several shipments of compound materials to Kessler's clinic. I thought, maybe this was bigger than just Kessler. Maybe the lab was behind it. Maybe Felix was the one pushing the drug and Kessler was just the prescribing doctor. I tracked Felix down. It took 9 days and a lot of Google searches. He'd left Vantage Bioanalytics in 2020 and was working for a different company in Minneapolis. I called him from my truck in a Hy-Vee parking lot. He picked up on the third ring. I told him who I was and what I'd found. He went quiet for a long time. Then he said he wasn't sure he should be talking to me about this. I told him 3 people were dead. He went quiet again. Then he said, and I remember it almost word for word, I filed an internal safety report about that compound in 2018. I told them the renal markers were concerning. I told them to pull it, and when I pushed harder, they let me go. He tried to stop it. The lab had killed the trial, but Kessler never stopped prescribing. Felix Arnaud wasn't the villain. He was the first person who tried to blow the whistle, and he'd lost his job for it. So it was Kessler. Just Kessler. A family doctor in a small Iowa town running his own unauthorized drug trial on his own patients for 5 years after it was supposed to end. And nobody, not the lab, not the pharmacy, not the hospital board, checked. And here's what I have to ask you. If you found out the doctor your whole town trusted, the man who delivered babies and set bones and sat in the church pews, was experimenting on his patients, and some of them died, what would you do? Would you keep going? Or would you protect your family and your life and just let it go? I'm honestly curious. Tell me what you think, because I went back and forth on that question for longer than I'm proud of. But I kept going, and the thing that happened next was a knife through both rear tires of my van. 3 weeks after the phone call to Minneapolis, I came out to my van in the morning and both rear tires were slashed. Clean cuts, not road damage. Someone had done it with a knife. Renee stood in the driveway and looked at me and didn't say a word. She didn't have to. I called the police. The deputy who came out, a young guy I didn't know, wrote it up as vandalism and said there'd been a string of tire slashings in Marion County. There hadn't. I checked. I was going to tell you about the letter, but actually wait. I need to go back to something first. A week before the tires, I'd gone into the clinic for the spring HVAC check. Routine. I'd done it every year for 9 years. The office manager met me at the door with coffee, same as always. I did the check, everything was fine. And on my way out, I passed Dr. Kessler in the hallway. He stopped me, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, this is the one that kept me up at night. He said, Lee, I hear you've been spending a lot of time out at the storage place on 163. Condenser trouble, right? I said, yeah. He said, good, those old units can be tricky. Let me know if you need anything. And he squeezed my shoulder and walked away. He knew I'd been in those files. And that hand on my shoulder, that wasn't concern. That was a message. The letter came 4 days later. Plain envelope, no return address, in my mailbox. One piece of paper, typed. It said, Pella takes care of its own. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I showed it to Renee. She said, Lee, we have a daughter. And she was right. Alma was 10. She was in 4th grade. She was learning the recorder from the woman who replaced Corinne Holst. I still have that letter. It's in my toolbox under the socket wrenches. I don't know why I keep it there. Maybe because the toolbox goes everywhere I go. I want to tell you I didn't waver, but I did. For about 11 days, I put the laptop away. I didn't go back to the storage unit. I didn't call anyone. I just went to work, fixed air conditioners, came home, helped Alma with homework, and tried to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. The first 2 nights I barely slept. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. Around 2 a.m. on the 3rd night, I got up and sat on the couch in the dark, scrolling through the photos on my phone. Not the evidence photos. Family ones. Alma at her school concert. Renee at the lake last summer. Normal things. Renee found me there at 3 a.m.
She didn't say anything, she just sat down next to me and put her hand on my arm, and we sat there until the coffee maker turned on at 5:30. That was when I understood what the fear was actually about. It wasn't Kessler. It wasn't the letter. It was the idea that this could take my family's ordinary life and break it.
But I kept thinking about those red dots. 3 circles in red ink, each one a person. And then Kessler did something that made me certain I couldn't stop. I was at the IGA picking up groceries. He was in the produce section. He saw me, walked over, and he said, calmly, with a basket of bell peppers in his hand, "Lee, I want you to know that I've always considered you a friend, and friends look out for each other. You understand that, right?" He said it with that warm, doctorly smile he gave everyone, and I just nodded and said, "Sure, Merritt." But here's what he didn't know. While I was standing there in the produce aisle, nodding at him, I had already sent copies of every photograph to a secure email address that Felix Arnault had set up for me. The man Kessler was trying to scare had already made sure those files couldn't disappear. That's the thing about being reliable. It cuts both ways. Hit subscribe if you haven't, because what happened in the next 8 weeks is where this whole thing broke open. And I almost missed it. The 11 days of silence were over. I went back to work. But I didn't go back to the storage unit. I'd already gotten what I needed from there. Instead, I started talking to people, carefully, one at a time. The first person was a pharmacist in Oskaloosa who'd been filling prescriptions for Kessler's patients for years. I didn't walk in and accuse anyone of anything. I just asked him if he'd ever noticed anything unusual about Kessler's prescriptions. He straightened up behind the counter. His face changed. Not guilt, exactly. More like something he'd been carrying for a long time, shifting around. "I followed standard protocol," he said. "I flagged a compound I didn't recognize 3 years ago. I called the clinic and was told it was a specialty formulation from an out-of-state lab. Approved. Was it?" I asked. "I called the prescribing office. That's what the regulations say to do. I called, I got an answer, I filled the prescription." He was looking at the counter, not at me. "That's the job." I waited. "But the thing is," he said, and his voice dropped, "I should have called the board, not the clinic. The clinic was the source. You don't verify a source with the source." He looked up. "I knew that. I knew that at the time." I talked to a nurse next. Not the office manager, she was too close to Kessler, but a woman who had worked at the clinic from 2017 to 2020, before she moved to a practice in Des Moines. I drove up there on a Saturday. She met me at a Panera near the interstate. She said, "I noticed the T4 patients always came in through the back entrance, scheduled at the end of the day, after regular hours. I asked the office manager about it once, and she told me it was a special program for patients with chronic conditions who needed privacy." Did you believe her? She looked at her coffee. I didn't not believe her. I stopped asking. Everyone stopped asking. That's what I kept finding. Not one person lied to me. Not one person said, "I never noticed anything." They all noticed. The pharmacist noticed. The nurse noticed. A billing clerk I talked to, she noticed that the lab invoices were paid from a separate account, not the clinic's main operating fund. She also mentioned something that caught me off guard. A few of the lab payment authorizations had been signed by someone other than Kessler, an office administrator. I wrote the name down. I'd come back to it later, but for a few days I wondered if maybe Kessler hadn't been acting entirely alone. The whole system was built on nobody asking the second question. The first question was easy. Is this normal? And the answer was always, Dr. Kessler knows what he's doing. And that was enough. For years, for decades. Because he was Merritt Kessler. He delivered your children. He held your hand when your father was dying. He was at every town event, every fundraiser, every church service. You don't question a man like that. Not in Pella. Not unless you're an HVAC technician with no medical degree and no authority and nothing to lose except everything. I talked to Boyd Linden's daughter. She lived in a duplex on the east side of Pella with 2 cats and a vegetable garden that Boyd had helped her plant the year before he died. She told me her father had trusted Dr. Kessler completely. She said, "Dad called him the best doctor he'd ever had. He said Dr. Kessler actually listened." And he did listen. That's the thing I couldn't get past. Kessler was a good listener. He was kind. He remembered birthdays. He gave out candy canes at Christmas. He was everything a small-town doctor is supposed to be, except that he was also running an unauthorized experiment on the people who trusted him most. Boyd's daughter cried when I showed her the file with her father's name and the red dot. She held the photograph on her phone and just stared at it. I sat in her kitchen and waited. There was nothing else to do. Darren Holst called me every Tuesday evening. The last week of May, he called and said, "How are you doing?" And before I could answer, he said, "And I don't mean the investigation, I mean you." I told him I was tired. He said, "Yeah." Then he told me his older boy had made the varsity baseball team, and that Corinne would have been at every game with a bag of sunflower seeds. We talked about that for a while, just sunflower seeds and baseball. And it was the first normal conversation I'd had in weeks. At the end, same as always, he said, "Corinne would have wanted someone to know." That line, I heard it every Tuesday for months. It was the only thing that kept me going some weeks. By June of 2024, I had the following: 312 photographs of clinic records, the complete trial protocol, 47 pages, lab invoices from Vantage Bioanalytics going back to 2017, testimony from Felix Arnault confirming the trial had been discontinued, statements, not recorded, just my notes, from the pharmacist, the former nurse, the billing clerk, and 2 family members of deceased patients. I also had something I hadn't expected. When I was going through the patient outcome file for the 4th time, I noticed that the dosage column had a progression pattern. Each patient's dosage increased every 8 weeks. The 3 patients who died, Boyd, Corinne, and Patrice, were the ones whose dosages had been raised the most, the highest concentrations. They weren't just patients. They were the ones getting the strongest dose. He was testing escalation. He wanted to know how much the body could take. I need to tell you where my head was at this point. I'd been doing this for 3 months. Renee and I barely talked about it anymore, not because she didn't care, but because every time we talked about it, we talked about the risk. My HVAC contracts were already thinning. 2 clients had canceled without explanation, both connected to the clinic. The office manager had stopped offering me coffee when I came for the spring check. Small things. But in a town the size of Pella, small things are everything. Darren Holst called me once a week, every Tuesday evening. One night in early June, he asked how the investigation was going, and I told him I was thinking about whether to go to the board or the press. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Lee, do what you can live with." That was all. No pressure, just the truth of it. Something I realized during those weeks, the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was knowing I'd never trust the same way again. I knew I needed help, real help. Not a pharmacist who noticed something, not a nurse who stopped asking. I needed someone with authority. The storage facility owner had mentioned he was thinking about clearing out unclaimed units before winter. He'd said it offhand. I need to get that south row cleaned out before the snow comes. But it hit me in the chest. If those boxes disappeared before anyone with authority saw the originals, the photographs on my laptop would be all I had. And a man like Kessler would have lawyers who could make phone photos look like anything. Over the next several days, I went back and forth on whether to take what I had to the Iowa Board of Medicine or to the press. The board would be slow. The press would be loud. I sat at the kitchen table 3 nights in a row with the laptop open and the board's complaint form on the screen. Each night, I'd type a few sentences, delete them, close the laptop, and go stand on the back porch, listening to the crickets. On the 4th morning, Renee put a cup of coffee next to the laptop and said, "Just call them, Lee." I called Felix Arnault. He said, "If you go to the press, they'll need documentation you can verify. If you go to the board, they'll need documentation they can verify. Either way, the records have to be bulletproof." There's something about the careful way he is with things, precise, calm, the way a person gets when they've already lost a career over the same question. I decided to go to the board first, then the press if the board didn't act. I called the Iowa Board of Medicine on July 2nd, 2024. I spoke to an investigator. I didn't give her my name. I described the records, the compound, the 3 deaths. She said, "Sir, if you have evidence of an unauthorized clinical trial resulting in patient deaths, this is something we take very seriously. Can you bring the documentation to our office in Des Moines?" Would you have done it? Would you have driven to Des Moines with a box full of a man's own records? A man who knew your name, knew where you lived, knew where your daughter went to school, and handed them to a state investigator? Would you have trusted a system that had already missed this for 5 years to do the right thing now? Think about that for a second, because I did. July 8th, 2024. I loaded the originals into a cardboard box, put it in the back of my van under a drop cloth, and drove 90 minutes to Des Moines. Renee kissed me on the cheek before I left and said, "Be careful." That was all. The investigator took the box. She took my name. She said they'd be in touch. And for 6 weeks, nothing happened. Not a word. I'll get to why in a minute. But during those 6 weeks, Merritt Kessler was still seeing patients, still prescribing, still smiling. The board called me on August 19th. The investigator said they'd verified the lab records with Vantage Bioanalytics. The trial had been officially discontinued in July 2018. No authorization for continued prescribing after that date. She also said something that I didn't expect. She said the board had identified 4 additional patients on the T4 dosage list who had experienced serious renal complications but survived. 4 more, not 3 deaths. 3 deaths and 4 near deaths. 7 people, 31 prescriptions, 1 doctor. The board had already contacted the Marion County Attorney's Office. There was going to be a formal public hearing, September 11th. And they asked me if I would present the records at a town council session, because the county attorney wanted the community to see the evidence in an open setting before the criminal case was filed. I said yes. And for the next 23 days, I didn't sleep well. Not once. In the days before the hearing, I saw Kessler one more time. I was getting gas. He pulled up to the pump next to mine. He got out and looked at me. And this time he didn't smile. He said, "You know, Lee, people in this town are going to remember who tried to tear it apart, and they're going to remember who held it together. I've held this town together for 23 years. What have you done?" I didn't answer. I just finished filling my tank and drove away. My hands were steady, and that scared me because steady wasn't how I felt. September 11th, 2024, Town Council Chamber, Pella City Hall, 7 p.m. I got there at 6:30. The room was already half full. Darren Holst was sitting in the back row. Boyd's daughter was next to him. There were faces I recognized, teachers, shop owners, people I'd fixed furnaces for. And in the front row, same as always, Merritt Kessler. Dark blazer, reading glasses folded in his breast pocket. He looked like he was there for a budget vote. The county attorney spoke first. Brief, clinical. He introduced the board's findings, and then he turned to me. I walked to the podium. I had the box under my arm, the same box I'd taken to Des Moines. I set it on the podium and opened it. My fingers were clumsy with the lid, and it took me 2 tries. "My name is Lee Patton. I'm an HVAC technician. I don't have a medical degree. I found these records in a storage unit on Route 163 while checking a condenser coil." I held up the trial protocol. I read the header. "Exploratory evaluation of T4 compound in treatment-resistant inflammatory conditions." I read the discontinuation stamp. July 2018. Then I held up the patient outcome file. I started to read the 3 names with red dots. Boyd Linden. Corinne Holst. My voice caught on Corinne's name, just for a second, and I had to look at the back wall of the room to keep going. Patrice Delacroix. Then I read the dates. Boyd's dosage started after the trial was discontinued. Corinne's started 2 years after. Patrice's started 3 years after. The room was quiet. Not silent quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear people breathing differently. Kessler stood up. He looked at the county attorney and he said, This is taken completely out of context. Those records are clinic property. He had no right." "Dr. Kessler," the county attorney said, "please sit down." He didn't sit down. He turned to the room, and this is where his face changed. Not dramatically, not like in a movie. His lower lip just trembled for half a second, and then he said, loudly to the room,
I was trying to help them. Every single one of them came to me because nobody else could help them. Nobody else was even trying. I took the risk because the system wouldn't. And for half a second, I felt something I wasn't expecting. Not sympathy, something closer to exhaustion. 6 months of carrying what he'd done, and now the room was hearing it, and I thought it would feel better. It didn't.
Someone in the room, I think it was Boyd's daughter's neighbor, said, "Boyd trusted you." Just like that, flat, not angry, just a fact. And Kessler turned toward the voice, and something happened to his eyes, just for a moment. I don't know what I saw, pain, maybe. Or maybe just the realization that the room wasn't going to save him. The county attorney presented the board's findings, the verification from Vantage Bioanalytics, the 4 additional patients with renal complications, and then he read something I hadn't known. The dosage escalation pattern showed that Kessler had increased doses specifically after patients reported side effects. Every complaint was met with an increase. Every "doctor, something doesn't feel right," was answered with more of the thing that was killing them. Kessler's attorney, a lawyer from Des Moines, tried to intervene, said the records were obtained without authorization. The county attorney said, "The board received these records through a voluntary citizen report. The authenticity has been verified. We're not in a courtroom tonight, counselor. We're in a public hearing." Kessler sat back down. He put his reading glasses on and then took them off again. He folded his hands, unfolded them, and the room watched. When it was over, I walked out of that building and sat in my van in the parking lot. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I couldn't make them stop. I put my forehead against the side window and closed my eyes. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't proud. I was just empty. And underneath the emptiness there was this low, steady anger. Not at Kessler, not anymore. At the fact that it had taken 6 months and an HVAC technician to do what a medical board and a pharmacy and an entire hospital should have done 5 years ago. Darren knocked on my window. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. And after a while I rolled down the window and he said, "Thank you." That was it. Thank you. 2 words that cost me 6 months and most of my peace of mind. Merritt Kessler was arrested on September 24th, 2024. 3 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 12 counts of administering unauthorized pharmaceutical compounds. The Iowa Board of Medicine revoked his license on October 3rd. The Tulip Time banner. They showed his Citizen of the Year photograph on the news, the one where he's grinning in front of the Tulip Time banner. Corinne Holst ran that festival choir. She stood on those risers every May and directed 38 kids in matching shirts. And there's his picture, smiling in front of the same banner she arranged every year. The fallout was complicated. Darren thanked me publicly at a community meeting. Boyd's daughter wrote a letter to the Pella Chronicle saying her father deserved justice. But other people were angry at me, not at Kessler, at me. A woman at the IGA told me I'd destroyed the only good doctor this town ever had. A man I'd done HVAC for 15 years canceled his contract and told Renee it was because he didn't want that kind of trouble around his house. One of the strangest moments was a guy from church who stopped me in the parking lot, shook my hand and said, "You did the right thing, Lee. I just wish it hadn't been you who had to do it." He meant it kindly, but there was something in the way he said it, not quite relief, not quite distance, just the sense that he was glad the truth existed and glad he hadn't been the one to say it. 2 families from the church stopped speaking to us. Alma came home from school one day and said a boy in her class told her that her dad was a snitch. She was 10. Renee handled it better than I did. She told Alma that telling the truth is never wrong, even when people don't want to hear it. And Alma said, "But why are they mad at Dad and not at the doctor?" And Renee said, "Because it's easier to be mad at the person who told you than the person who lied to you." That's probably the smartest thing anyone said through this whole thing. It's been about 7 months since the hearing. I'm telling you this in April of 2025. Kessler's trial is scheduled for June. The county attorney told me I'll be called as a witness. I've already given my deposition, 3 hours in a conference room in Des Moines, answering questions about condenser coils and banker's boxes. The defense attorney asked me to describe my qualifications in medicine. I said, "None." He asked me what gave me the authority to review clinical records. I said, I can read. Renee said later that I should have been more diplomatic. She's probably right. My HVAC business lost about 30% of its clients after everything came out. Some came back, some didn't. I picked up new work in Oskaloosa and Newton, people who'd heard the story and wanted to support me. So the numbers are close to where they were. Not the same, but close. Renee went back to part-time bookkeeping to cover the gap in the lean months. She never complained about it. Not once. Some mornings I'd catch her at the kitchen table before dawn, going through invoices, and she'd look up and say, "Go fix something," and wave me out the door. Darren Holst planted a garden in his backyard this spring. Tomatoes, peppers, basil. He told me he talks to Corinne while he's watering, and I didn't know what to say to that, so we just stood there looking at the tomato plants. Alma started 5th grade. She plays the clarinet now, switched from the recorder. She's terrible at it, honestly. But she practices every night after dinner, and the sound of a 10-year-old murdering a clarinet solo has become the sound of my house being normal again. I hold on to that. There's a bench at the Tulip Time grounds with Merritt Kessler's name on it. They haven't removed it yet. I don't know if they will. Corinne Holst should have turned 48 this year. Her boys are in high school now. Darren showed me a photograph of the 4 of them at a picnic taken the summer before she got sick. She's laughing in it. Full laugh. And I keep thinking, she trusted him. She took the pills he gave her because he was her doctor, and she believed he was helping. That's what gets me. Not the compound, not the trial, not the cover-up. It's the trust. Boyd Linden was a maintenance worker. Patrice Delacroix filed records at the county office. They were ordinary people who did ordinary things and trusted their doctor. And that trust killed them. I found the truth because I know where pipes go. That's it. An HVAC technician crawled into a storage unit to check a condenser and found what a medical board, a hospital, a pharmacy, and an entire town missed for 5 years. If you've been here for this whole story, thank you. Sharing this was harder than finding those files. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that ordinary people can make a difference. Not because they're brave, but because they can't look away. Let me ask you something. Is there a person in your life, a doctor, a teacher, a leader, that everyone trusts without question? Someone so good that the idea of doubting them feels wrong? Trust should come with open eyes. Tell me about that person in the comments. I want to hear your story. My name is Lee Patton. I'm 38 years old. I live in Pella, Iowa. I fix air conditioning systems and furnaces. I look down at my hands for a second. Same hands that check condenser coils and tighten duct fittings. And then I close the box. And on a Tuesday in March, I opened a box that somebody thought they'd gotten rid of. They hadn't.